She was walking along a familiar forest path when she noticed a rusty hearse covered in moss. The door was slightly ajar. Inside was a coffin that had clearly been placed there recently. She didn't know that she had found the hiding place of a wealthy man who had died, and that those who had tried to steal his valuables were already on her trail. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Evelyn Carter had not planned her escape from the city as an act of desperation, though in truth, it felt very close to that. The decision had come quietly, without drama, the way exhaustion sometimes settles into a person so deeply that it forces them into movement, simply because staying still has become unbearable. She had woken one morning in her small, overly tidy apartment and realized she no longer recognized the life inside those walls. The divorce papers on her dining table were already signed. The job she had once given 15 years of her life to had been gone for months, and the phone that once buzzed with messages from her daughter now lay silent more often than not. The apartment was immaculate, but it was an emptiness polished to a shine. It felt like a waiting room where nothing was ever meant to happen. The idea of the hike began as a whisper. Evelyn had always found solace in the woods, even as a child, when she would walk alone behind her parents' house for hours and return home with muddy boots and leaves in her hair. She hadn't realized how much she missed that feeling, so she packed a bag, more carefully than necessary, folding her clothes with precision, checking and rechecking her gear, as if the ritual itself might steady her. Her home was quiet during this packing, every zipper sounding too loud, every footstep echoing. On some level, she sensed she was not preparing for just a short hike. It felt like she was breaking away from something that had been suffocating her for too long. The morning she left, she paused at the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was still familiar, but less certain. Her brown hair had threads of gray she had stopped bothering to cover, the faint lines around her eyes deeper than she remembered from even a year ago. She pressed her fingers lightly to the glass, almost as if to reassure the person staring back that she was still real. Then she whispered, "I need to go." And the words surprised her by how truthful they felt. There was no one else to hear them, but saying them aloud made something inside her settle. The forest greeted her with a quiet so complete it felt sacred. As soon as she stepped past the trailhead, she felt the air change cooler, heavier with the scent of pine and damp earth. The light filtered through the canopy above in thin, soft beams, illuminating drifting motes of dust like small, wandering stars. The ground was soft beneath her boots, and every step carried a subtle crunch of needles and leaves. For the first time in months, her thoughts began to slow, no longer racing ahead of one another, no longer arranging themselves into lists of what she should have said or should have done. The forest, in its vastness, seemed to absorb her anxieties until they became small and distant. The first day passed in a steady rhythm. She walked, she breathed, she listened. At moments, she paused simply to feel the breeze on her face or to watch the subtle tremble of a fern lifting itself toward the sun. The absence of voices was not lonely. It was freeing. She set up camp near a creek, listened to the water lapping at stones, and felt sleep tug at her far earlier than usual. Under the quiet canopy of the woods, she slept deeply for the first time in weeks. On the second day, the forest grew wilder. The path narrowed and twisted, overgrown in places where few hikers seemed to pass. Evelyn didn't mind. In fact, she preferred the solitude. It gave her space to untangle the knotted thoughts she had carried for so long. Still, a faint unease occasionally brushed across her like a shadow. Twice she paused, believing she had heard footsteps behind her, slow and uneven, like someone trying not to be heard. Each time she turned, she found only stillness. Towering trees, moss-covered stones, the whisper of distant leaves. She scolded herself for letting her nerves invent threats, blaming it on the isolation and the lingering tension of her life's recent upheavals. By the afternoon of the third day, clouds began gathering overhead. A low wind threaded through the branches, carrying with it the metallic scent of coming rain. Evelyn studied her map and decided to veer off the main route to find a better source of water before the storm hit. She stepped away from the marked trail, moving carefully through uneven terrain. The forest here felt older, less touched by human hands. Fallen logs lay covered in thick carpets of moss, and the air was cooler, carrying a faint smell of wild mint. As she climbed over a cluster of stones, something dark caught her eye. At first she thought it was a large tree trunk charred from lightning, but as she stepped closer, threading through thorny underbrush, the shape became clearer. Her breath hitched. It was not a tree at all. Buried halfway in tall grass and creeping vines was an old black vehicle, its roof sagging, its sides mottled with rust. The windows were opaque with years of grime, one of them cracked into a spiderweb pattern. A shiver ran up her spine when she recognized the long, rectangular silhouette. It was a hearse. Not a modern one, but an older model. A heavy steel beast from decades past, the kind used by funeral homes that no longer existed. Evelyn stood frozen for a long moment, her heartbeat thudding strangely against her ribs. How long had it been here? Why here, in the middle of nowhere? The forest had begun reclaiming it, grass growing beneath its tires, vines weaving across its doors. But something about it felt wrong. Wrong in a way she could not immediately explain. She approached slowly, each step deliberate, senses sharpened. Up close, the details told conflicting stories. The exterior was ancient, as though abandoned for years, but one of the doors on the passenger side was slightly ajar. Not broken, not rust-welded shut like she would expect from a car left outdoors for decades. Just left open, as if someone had stepped out recently. Her gaze drifted toward the ground. There were faint impressions in the soil, boots perhaps, though softened by time or rain. Fresh enough to notice, old enough to be unclear. A wave of unease swept through her. She reached for the door and hesitated. Logic told her to walk away. Curiosity refused to let her. Something inside her insisted she had stumbled onto something hidden, something that was never meant to be found by a lone hiker wandering through the woods. Her fingers curled around the cold metal handle, and the door creaked open with a protesting groan. The first thing she noticed was the smell cleaner. Not the musty, molding scent she expected from a long-abandoned car, but the faint, sharp aroma of disinfectant mixed with the woody scent of polished lacquer. The interior was shockingly clean, unrealistically so. The dashboard was battered and old, with wires exposed and dust clinging to the cracks, but the back compartment, the one built to carry coffins, was spotless, as if someone had wiped it down recently. And there, occupying most of the space in the rear, was a coffin. Her chest tightened. The coffin was new. It gleamed with a rich black sheen, its silver handles gleaming faintly even in the muted forest light. She stepped closer, pulse pounding in her ears. The straps around the coffin were taut, clean, modern. Nothing about it matched the decrepit state of the car. Evelyn swallowed. She knew she should leave, but some deep instinct curiosity mixed strangely with dread pushed her forward. The lid of the coffin was closed, but not locked. Her fingers hovered above the smooth surface. She imagined the absurdity of someone stumbling upon her body if this curiosity killed her, and yet that didn't stop her. With a trembling breath, she pressed her palms against the lid and pushed it upward. The coffin was empty, but not untouched. The velvet lining bore small indentations, as if something heavy had once rested there. A small piece of fabric lay crumpled near the foot, the remnants of what might have been a pouch or bag. And scattered across the fabric were coins. Old coins. Gold gleamed faintly beneath a thin layer of dust. Evelyn's mind raced. These were not modern. They looked antique, historic even. Her hand moved almost involuntarily, fingertips brushing one of the coins. It was cold, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. She lifted it into the light, turning it slowly. The weight was unmistakable. Gold. Her breath grew unsteady. She scanned the coffin again, and that was when she noticed it. A small seam in the wood near the upper edge of the lining, almost hidden, almost perfect. Her pulse quickened. She pressed her thumb against it. The panel shifted only a little, but enough to prove it wasn't part of the original design. A hidden compartment. The air around her seemed to thicken. She pushed the panel fully aside, and the breath was knocked from her chest. Inside the compartment was a trove of valuables, jewelry from another era, brooches set with rubies, delicate rings studded with emeralds, a pair of antique gold watches, each engraved with intricate patterns, silver bars wrapped in protective cloth, a collection of miniature paintings, their colors still vibrant despite their age. Each item could have belonged to a museum, not a forgotten coffin in a forest. Nestled among the treasure was a folder of documents. Evelyn lifted it carefully. Inside were certificates of authenticity, estate papers, handwritten notes of purchases made decades earlier, and newspaper clippings. One clipping bore a headline she recognized from recent news. A reclusive billionaire had died unexpectedly just a week earlier. The article mentioned his vast private collection of rare historical artifacts and precious heirlooms assets, reportedly worth tens of millions of dollars. Assets that, according to the article, were now in legal limbo as the man had no direct heirs. Evelyn felt a chill crawl across her skin. Someone had stolen part of the billionaire's collection, and they had hidden it in a coffin inside a hearse buried in the woods. The sound of a twig snapping jolted her so violently she nearly dropped the folder. Her eyes shot toward the trees. She froze, breath locked in her throat. The forest had shifted again, not the calm silence from earlier, but something alert, listening. She crouched low, heart pounding painfully. Voices drifted through the trees, male voices, low, sharp, tense. Was the door open before? Don't know. Could have been wind. The wind doesn't open doors. Her blood turned to ice. We need to check the coffin. Panic surged up her spine. She lowered herself onto the ground and crawled beneath the hearse just as footsteps approached. From her hiding spot, she saw two pairs of boots moving through the grass, stopping inches from the car. One of the men cursed under his breath. The other sniffed the air. Someone's been here. Her pulse hammered so loudly she feared they would hear it. She pressed her face into the dirt, forcing herself to stay silent. "Find them," one of the men said. "If they took photos, we're done." She felt the blood drain from her face. Done. That could only mean one thing. Whoever these men were, whatever scheme they were part of, they couldn't risk exposure. And someone who couldn't risk exposure wouldn't hesitate to silence a witness. Once the men moved away to follow her trail, Evelyn slid out from beneath the hearse, grabbed her pack with trembling hands, and fled into the forest, branches whipping against her face, roots threatening to trip her. She didn't dare look back. She didn't dare stop. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty as she plunged deeper into the trees. She had discovered something she was never meant to find. And now, someone was coming to find her. Evelyn ran long after her lungs began to burn, long after her legs felt heavy and uncoordinated beneath her. The forest around her had dissolved into a blur of green and shadow, branches clawing at her sleeves as if trying to slow her down. She didn't dare stop until the voices behind her faded completely. When she finally pressed herself against the trunk of an ancient pine to catch her breath, she felt as though the entire forest pulsed with the frantic rhythm of her heart. The air smelled of sap and damp earth, grounding her just enough to keep her from collapsing. For a while she simply stood there, pressed to the rough bark, forcing herself to breathe slowly, deeply, quietly. Her pulse throbbed painfully in her neck. The echo of those men's voices still rang in her ears, sharp and frightening. She replayed their words again and again, each repetition confirming what she already knew. They had not just stumbled upon that hearse by accident. They had been using it, storing something, guarding something. Something worth a staggering amount of money enough that the discovery of her presence had thrown them instantly into panic. The thought that they were now looking for her made her stomach twist. In an instant, the quiet sanctuary of the woods had become a trap of shadowed paths and unseen dangers. Every rustle of leaves felt like footsteps. Every shifting of branches felt like an approach. She closed her eyes, gripping the bark as though it might anchor her to something safe. But safety felt impossibly far away. She forced herself to think clearly. She needed distance. She needed to make her trail harder to follow. And above all, she needed to understand what exactly she had stumbled into, not because curiosity still tugged at her, though it did, but because the more she understood, the better her chances of surviving. Her hand still trembled as she unzipped her pack and pulled out her phone. She had taken photos inside the coffin. Perhaps without fully recognizing the danger at the time, she had captured evidence of the treasure, the documents, the coins, everything that made that hidden compartment so valuable. With shaking fingers, she swiped through the images, and the sight of them felt unreal. It was as if she were looking at artifacts lifted from a museum display, each polished stone and gilded edge illuminated in the dim light of the hearse. She zoomed in on the newspaper clipping showing the billionaire's face, an old man with sunken eyes and a thin line for a mouth. The date printed at the top was less than 10 days old. He had died alone, in a massive, secluded estate the public rarely saw. His life had been a collection of eccentric habits and staggering wealth, rumors swirling around him of secret acquisitions and rare artifacts bought through private deals. He had no confirmed heirs. According to the article, his estate was in the early stages of being seized by the government pending the discovery of any distant relatives. In such cases, the law required every asset, every coin, every painting, every relic to be catalogued. Nothing should leave the estate until the court settled the matter. Yet here, in a hidden coffin inside a forest hearse, sat pieces of that very estate. Her pulse quickened in anger as much as fear. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. Someone had removed these items illegally, perhaps even before the man's death was fully confirmed to the public. Someone had planned to move them out of sight, out of reach of auditors, inspectors, lawyers, everyone. And she had seen it. The weight of that realization nearly buckled her knees. She needed to move. Evelyn pocketed her phone and forced her body into motion again, moving through the forest with careful, deliberate steps. She avoided soft soil where footprints would be clear. She stepped on rocks, fallen trunks, and roots wherever possible. She skirted along the edges of slopes and moved through shallow, rocky streams where her trail would vanish entirely. Every decision felt like a calculation of survival, and she clung to the knowledge she had gained from years of hiking. The forest was not simply closing around her, it was offering her cover. After nearly an hour of cautious movement, she paused beside a narrow stream whose water rippled softly over stones. She crouched and splashed some on her face, the coldness jolting her sharply awake. The sky above had darkened with the promise of rain, and distant thunder rolled like a warning. Water would help obscure her tracks, but it would also make travel harder. She followed the stream uphill, staying close to the water's edge, pausing frequently to listen. A squirrel flitted across the forest floor nearby. A distant woodpecker hammered against bark. Birds chirped intermittently, their calls sharp against the rising wind. Nothing sounded human, but she kept moving. Her mind returned to the hidden compartment, to the coins and jewels nestled inside. She had spent a few astonished seconds examining each item before panic had driven her out of the hearse. She remembered the delicate filigree of the gold rings, the intricate engravings on the watches, the thin silver chains tangled among the velvet lining. And she remembered the documents, the folder filled with proof of ownership, full catalogs of the billionaire's collection, and letters addressed to legal counsel never sent. Every piece had screamed legitimacy. Each second she spent thinking about it made everything feel more surreal. She had gone into the forest seeking peace, and had instead uncovered a crime so enormous she could barely fathom it. She wondered who the men were. Employees, thieves, someone hired by the estate's insiders? Their voices had not sounded calm or professional. They had sounded scared, desperate, and desperate men could be unpredictable. The stream led her into a denser area of the woods, where the trees grew closer together and the underbrush thickened. Evelyn's steps slowed as she carefully maneuvered through the greenery. Branches tugged at her backpack, and low-hanging limbs brushed her shoulders. She paused again, straining to listen above the wind. A faint murmur drifted across the trees. Her breath caught. She turned, trying to pinpoint the direction. It was distant, but not distant enough. The sound faded, then returned, a low, indistinct hum that rose and fell like 2 or 3 voices, talking just out of reach. The men had not given up. Fear surged through her chest again, gripping her like a vice. She backed away from the sound and hurried deeper into the trees. But as she crossed a fallen log, she misjudged the height and landed awkwardly. Pain shot up her ankle, sharp and sudden. She winced and gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out. Her ankle didn't feel broken, but it throbbed with every step. Panic fluttered in her chest. An injury now would be disastrous. She forced herself onward, limping slightly but determined not to slow down. The forest was becoming more chaotic with the incoming storm gusts of wind, rattled branches, and the first droplets of rain began tapping against leaves like fingers drumming a warning. The air felt electrically charged, heavy with anticipation. She found a slope ahead, steep but navigable, and decided to climb. Higher ground would give her an advantage, a vantage point to assess the terrain. Digging her boots into the soft earth, she pulled herself upward, grabbing roots and branches for support. Her injured ankle flared with pain, but she ignored it, pushing herself until she finally reached a flattened outcropping of rock. From there, she looked down at the forest below, scanning for movement. At first, she saw nothing but trembling foliage and waving tree limbs. Then, between 2 distant pines, she caught a flash of dark fabric. Someone moving. Then another movement. 2 figures. Slowly making their way through the woods in her direction, her breath shuddered. They had found her trail despite her precautions. She needed to be smarter. The rain intensified, pattering steadily now. She crouched low, gripping her backpack straps tightly. She could use the storm to her advantage. Water would wash away what tracks remained. Noise would mask her movement. Darkness would give her time. She took a deep breath, letting the cold air settle the rising panic. She descended the far side of the slope and eased herself into a shallow ravine lined with thick ferns. The ravine curved sharply, creating a natural corridor through the woods. It was risky. If she were discovered, There would be fewer escape routes, but it was also a place where sound and visibility would be muffled by the terrain. She moved carefully, each step deliberate. The ravine eventually opened into a clearing dominated by a massive spruce tree whose roots rose from the earth like a network of knotted veins. Beneath its largest root was a hollow space, dark, dry, shielded from the rain. Evelyn hesitated, then crawled beneath the root, tucking herself into the cramped shelter. The earth was cool beneath her palms. She steadied her breathing, listening through the patter of rain and wind. Minutes stretched painfully. She could hear nothing but the storm. Then, faintly through the curtain of water, the sound of footsteps swelled again. Harsh voices broke through the rain. She came this way. She's hurt. Tracks show she's favoring the right foot. A spike of dread shot through her. They were close, far too close. She pressed herself deeper into the hollow, holding her breath. Leaves rustled overhead as the men moved into the clearing. Their boots squelched in the wet earth. One of them paused directly above her hiding place. "She's smart," he said. "But not enough." Evelyn's fingers curled into fists, nails pressing sharply into her palms. She inched further back into the hollow, feeling the cold earth against her spine. "If she's got photos," the second man growled, "we can't let her leave this forest." The storm thundered overhead. Lightning flashed between trees, and the rumble that followed seemed to shake the ground. The two men stood there a moment longer before one of them muttered, "Split up. We'll circle around." Their footsteps faded gradually until only the storm remained. Evelyn waited, letting minutes drip by like melting ice. When she finally crawled out from beneath the root, her limbs were stiff, her breath unsteady. The clearing was empty, but she knew it wouldn't remain that way for long. She needed to move before they doubled back. The rain poured more heavily now, soaking her hair and clothes, running down her face in cold rivulets. She welcomed it. It would hide her. She limped toward the densest part of the forest, where the shadows clung thick and low. The pain in her ankle thudded with every step, but she pushed through it, fueled now by determination as much as fear. The forest path slanted downward until she reached a narrow gorge. A shallow stream ran along the bottom, swirling with rainwater. She followed it, stepping directly into the water with a grimace. The cold bit into her skin, but her footprints disappeared instantly. She waded along the stream until she reached a fork where two boulders formed a natural barrier. Behind those boulders lay a dark recess, half cave, half shelter. She squeezed inside, grateful for the cover. She sank to the ground, shivering but alive, listening to the sound of rain pounding against stone. Her mind wandered back to the hearse, the coins, the documents. She replayed each detail, trying to make sense of the men's conversation. The way they spoke suggested they were not masterminds. They were workers, people following orders, possibly hired by someone with access to the billionaire's estate. That meant their operation was organized, planned, and dangerous. But it also meant she had leverage. She had evidence. She took out her phone again, shielding its glow with her hand. The signal bar was empty, unsurprising, given the depth of the forest. But it didn't matter. If she reached higher ground, she might get a connection. Or she could wait until rescue teams searched for her. But she couldn't rely on luck. She needed to get out. Rain continued beating against the rocks, and thunder echoed across the hills. Evelyn leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Exhaustion tugged at her, but she refused to let herself sleep. Not yet. Not while danger prowled the woods outside. She forced herself to stay awake, to think. She had to stay ahead of those men. She had to find her way back to the main trail eventually. And she had to protect the evidence she carried more fiercely than anything else. She drew in a slow breath, bracing herself. The storm was beginning to ease, leaving behind a soft drizzle. That meant the men would resume hunting soon. She rose to her feet, every muscle protesting. She shouldered her pack again and stepped out into the wet forest, feeling the heavy weight of fear and resolve merging into one. She would not be caught. She would not let them take her phone. She would not die in these woods. With renewed determination, she moved deeper into the forest, and somewhere behind her, beyond the whisper of rain and rustle of branches, she heard the men calling to each other again, closer now, relentless in their pursuit. The hunt was far from over. The forest had changed its character by the time Evelyn pushed through another curtain of rain-damp branches and found herself on a narrow ridge overlooking the deeper valley ahead. Night was approaching faster than she expected. The storm had blurred the afternoon into a gray wash of cold air and trembling shadows, and now the sinking light cast a blue tint across everything. What earlier felt like a forest filled with hiding places now resembled a labyrinth where every step could lead her straight into the hands of the men who hunted her. Her ankle pulsed with every movement, a steady reminder of her vulnerability. She paused to catch her breath, wiping the wet strands of hair from her cheeks. The drizzle had faded into a soft mist that clung to her clothes and skin. She was shivering, her fingers cold and stiff, but her mind burned with one single purpose. She had to get out of the forest before the men closed in on her completely. The ridge where she now stood sloped down into the valley, where thick clusters of fir trees grew so closely together that their branches intertwined, forming a dark canopy above. Beneath that canopy, the ground dropped unevenly, marked by jagged rocks and twisting roots. It wasn't an easy descent, but it offered dense cover, which meant safety, at least temporarily. And she needed that more than anything. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of snapping twigs. Her breath froze. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The sound was distant, softened by the mist, but too deliberate to belong to wildlife. Someone was following her trail. Someone who didn't care about the noise they made. Someone closing the distance. She slipped down the ridge, using both hands to guide herself as her boots slid against wet soil. The descent was steep, and several times she nearly lost her footing. Her ankle screamed in pain, but adrenaline pushed her onward. Rainwater trickled down the slope like a thin stream, soaking her palms and seeping through her sleeves. Once she reached the bottom, she ducked beneath a fallen tree trunk and crawled through its underside, letting the dense shadow swallow her. She waited, trying to slow her breathing. The forest's rhythm shifted again. Wind sighed through the branches. Water dripped steadily from needles and leaves. And somewhere behind her came the low rumble of the men's voices, muddled by distance, but still unmistakable. They were talking to each other as they walked, no longer trying to mask their search. "There's no way she got far on that ankle," one voice said, sharp and irritated. "She's heading downhill," the other replied. "Water always runs to the valley. Follow it." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. She had followed the stream earlier. Of course they would predict that. They had lived near this forest, worked in it, maybe used it before. They knew the terrain better than she did. Her only advantage was unpredictability, and she needed to use it now. She crawled further through the undergrowth until she emerged behind a curtain of ferns that reached nearly to her shoulders. Here, the forest ground dipped into a gentler slope, winding deeper into shadow. She rose slowly and continued forward, careful to step only on stones or thick roots. Every soft patch of mud she avoided was one less track left behind. The forest canopy thickened overhead until the sky disappeared entirely. Darkness settled around her like a blanket, broken only by slivers of dying daylight filtering between branches. Her breathing steadied slightly, though her heart continued to thrum with fear. She would not survive the night if she didn't find a place to rest, hide, and plan her escape. She couldn't keep moving forever, not with her ankle and exhaustion dragging at her. She needed shelter, safety, a moment to think. And then, through the dense screen of trees, she saw it. A structure. At first, she thought it was just a large boulder or fallen tree, but as she crept closer, stepping gingerly over roots and broken branches, the shape sharpened into something unmistakable. A cabin, small, old, and battered by weather. Its wooden walls were warped by time, its roof sagging slightly beneath thick moss, but it was shelter. Evelyn's breath hitched. She scanned the clearing around it. No tracks, no signs of recent habitation. The air around it was still, untouched, except for the ferns that swayed softly in the breeze. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Quietly, she crossed the clearing. The cabin's door was crooked on its hinges, gaps visible where the wood had warped apart. She pushed it with her fingertips, and it gave way with a soft groan. Inside, the cabin was dim and musty. A mix of old wood, dust, and faint mildew filled the air. Faded light seeped through the cracks between boards, revealing a single room with a decaying table, a broken chair, and the remnants of a small stove rusted through with holes. A narrow cot sat in one corner, the mattress collapsed inward, stuffing spilling out like pale weeds. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't safe, but it was shelter. Evelyn stepped inside and closed the door behind her as gently as she could. The wind rattled the beams overhead, and loose droplets of water dripped rhythmically from the leaky roof. She set her backpack down and leaned her weight against the wall, exhaling shakily. For the first time since fleeing the hearse, she let the reality of her situation wash over her completely. Her hands trembled violently. Her ankle throbbed. Her breath came uneven and shallow. She pressed her palms to her eyes, fighting back tears she refused to let fall. She had stumbled into a crime bigger than she could have imagined. The men weren't protecting the forest. They weren't storing stolen items casually. They were part of something organized, deliberate, and dangerous. They had taken treasures belonging to a dead billionaire, a man with no heirs, whose death had already sparked legal disputes and media coverage. Someone high up must have known that if certain items disappeared before the government cataloged them, no one would ever notice. Not until it was too late. And she had found their transport. "Think," she whispered to herself. "Think." The photos on her phone were her only weapon, her only proof. Without them, she would be just another missing hiker who vanished without a trace. But with them, she had leverage. If she could reach civilization, if she could escape the forest, if the men didn't find her first. She dragged one of the wooden crates that lay near the door toward a wall, then stacked another on top of it, creating a makeshift barrier between herself and the entrance. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it would give her a few seconds of warning. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm fading outside. Evelyn moved toward the small window, pushing aside the warped shutter just enough to peer outside. The clearing was still empty. The forest loomed silently, branches swaying. She held her breath, listening. At first there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, footsteps again. Voices. Closer. She jerked back from the window, heart pounding. They were searching the valley methodically. They would reach this clearing eventually. The cabin would not protect her for long. She crouched beside the cot, trying to remain still. Her mind raced. They weren't giving up. They were motivated by fear. Not fear of her, but fear of the consequences of being exposed. Whoever was behind this operation would punish failure brutally. These men were not chasing her out of loyalty. They were chasing her out of desperation. The voices drew nearer, muffled by trees, but approaching steadily. She could distinguish words now. "Check the ridge again." "She can't be far." The rain slowed her down. Another voice, harsher. "If she gets out, we're dead." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the storm had mostly moved on. Evelyn's pulse surged. She scrambled to the back of the cabin, searching for something, anything, she could use as another escape route. The wooden planks were old, rotten in some places. She pushed on one and felt it give slightly beneath her hand. Another push, harder this time. The board cracked. She pressed again until the wood splintered inward, revealing a small hole. Through it, she saw dense shrubbery and a narrow drop into a ravine outside. It wasn't a doorway, not yet, but it could be. And it might be her only way out. She worked quickly, pulling at the rotted wood, ignoring the cuts it left on her fingers. The voices outside grew louder. "This fog makes everything look the same. Just keep searching. The boss wants her found." Evelyn's breath caught when the first shadow passed in front of the cabin. A silhouette, a man standing just beyond the tree line. She ducked lower, heart hammering. The man hesitated, scanning the clearing. He was only a few steps from the cabin now. If he looked closely, if he stepped closer. Another voice called out from deeper in the woods, and the man turned away reluctantly. He moved toward the sound, calling back, "I'm checking this side." Evelyn exhaled shakily. She widened the hole in the wall until it was large enough for her to fit through barely. She shoved her pack ahead of her, then crawled after it, scraping her knees against the rough wood. Once outside, she crouched low behind the brush and scanned the clearing. The cabin door had swung in slightly from wind. The men were too close to risk closing it. She slipped into the ravine and moved along its edge, letting the shadow swallow her completely. Her ankle screamed with every step, but she kept going, fueled now by pure survival. Branches whipped against her arms as she pushed deeper into the forest. She used the ravine like a hidden passageway, winding between stones and over fallen logs. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, but she forced herself not to stop. Not yet. Not here. The forest finally widened into a stretch of land where the trees thinned enough for patches of fading twilight to peek through. Below, she saw something she hadn't expected. A road, or what once had been a road. Broken asphalt, reclaimed by roots and moss, stretched in a crooked line toward the distant hills. It was old, abandoned, but it was still a path out. Relief washed through her like a wave, but it was fragile and fleeting. She approached carefully, scanning the area. The forest behind her felt like a living entity now, filled with the whispers of danger drawing nearer. If she followed the road long enough, it would lead her to the edge of the forest, to cell signal, to people, to safety. She took a step forward. A twig snapped to her left. She froze. Slowly, she turned her head. A man stood only 20 feet away among the trees, half hidden in shadow. His breath misted in the cooling air. His eyes locked immediately onto hers. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then he shouted, "She's here!" Evelyn ran. Pain shot up her ankle so violently she nearly fell, but she forced herself onward. She sprinted down the broken road, dodging roots and fragmented asphalt as branches whipped her shoulders from both sides. Behind her came pounding footsteps, multiple sets, gaining speed. "Stop! Don't let her reach the road!" She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her lungs burned. Her legs trembled. But adrenaline dragged her forward as the last remnants of daylight bled out behind the treetops. The men were too close. Their breath carried on the wind. Their footsteps dug into the earth. She stumbled around a bend in the road, heart hammering wildly in her chest. and then she saw it. A rusted metal bridge arching over a narrow river. Beyond it, the faint outline of a ranger tower, dilapidated, but still standing. Civilization. Her only chance. She rushed toward it with every last shred of strength she possessed, hearing the men closing in behind her. Rainwater splashed beneath her boots. The boards creaked beneath her weight. The tower rose ahead, dark and looming. "Don't you dare," one voice roared. Evelyn didn't stop. She reached the tower, grabbed the railing, and hauled herself up the first step, just as the men burst out of the trees behind her, and the world closed in around her once more. Evelyn felt the wooden steps tremble beneath her feet as she forced herself upward, gripping the railing with both hands to keep from collapsing. Her ankle throbbed so sharply that for a moment she thought she would black out, but fear kept her conscious. Below, the men burst from the trees in a surge of motion and shouts. Their footsteps slapped against the wet boards of the bridge, echoing through the valley like drumbeats announcing the inevitable. She climbed faster, each step scraping raw through her muscles, but the tower ladder loomed above her like a final trial she wasn't sure she had the strength to endure. She reached the platform where the stairs met the base of the ladder and looked up. The ladder stretched higher than it had seemed from below, its rungs darkened by age and slick with moss. The wind swayed the entire structure gently, as though warning her that nothing about this ascent would be stable or safe. Her fingers curled around the first rung. She pulled herself up, teeth clenched, breath heaving in and out. Her boot slipped once against the damp metal, sending a bolt of cold fear through her spine. The voices below grew louder. "She's heading up the tower! Cut her off at the base!" The threat of being trapped at the top sharpened every instinct. She climbed faster, ignoring the stabbing pain in her ankle, using mostly her arms to drag herself upward rung by rung. The tower groaned under her weight, or perhaps under the weight of the storm that gathered again at the horizon, rumbling softly like a distant predator. The sky had dimmed into a deep blue fading toward darkness. Her breath produced faint clouds in the cooling air. Halfway up the ladder, she dared a glance down. The first man had reached the base one of the same men she had glimpsed earlier near the clearing. His face was contorted with fury and panic, his hands gripping the railing as he looked up toward her. He shouted something she couldn't make out, but the tone was enough. Pure hostility. Pure desperation. Two others joined him moments later, scanning the tower, arguing briefly about something before one moved to the far side, perhaps searching for another way up. Evelyn forced her gaze upward again. She couldn't afford to look down. Fear would paralyze her. She had to move. Step. Pull. Step. Pull. Each motion sent fire up her injured ankle and tremors down her arms, but the top of the tower finally drew close. The small lookout room sat like a weathered crown on the structure, its windows cracked, its walls worn but intact enough to offer some kind of shelter. She hauled herself onto the final rung, pushed up with every remaining ounce of strength, and rolled onto the platform, gasping for air. For a long moment, she simply lay there, pressing her cheek against the cold boards, letting the trembling inside her settle. But the shouts below reminded her that she had no time. She forced herself to her feet, limping toward the lookout room. The door hung open, one hinge broken, the wood warped by years of storms. She stepped inside. The room was small, barely large enough for a table and a broken stool that lay overturned in the corner. Maps, long since destroyed by weather, clung in tatters to the walls. A rusted lantern sat on the floor near the window, its glass cracked. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and old dust, but the room provided something she desperately needed: a view. She approached the window that faced the forest, hoping for any sign of a ranger still using the old trails, any distant cabin light, any hope. But the forest stretched outward endlessly, a dark ocean of trees. The sky above was clearing slightly, revealing pale streaks of moonlight beginning to gather behind thinning clouds. Behind her, the tower shook. The men were climbing. She turned sharply, her pulse leaping. Through the open door, she could see the ladder swaying slightly from the weight of at least one person ascending it. The rungs creaked. The metal groaned. Their grunts and breaths carried upward. She backed away from the doorway, her mind racing. She had reached the top, but now what? There was no help coming, no weapon, no way out. Unless her eyes drifted toward the back corner of the room, where the wood floorboards were uneven. One board stuck slightly upward, as though something beneath had pushed against it. She limped over, crouched, and pulled on the loose plank. It lifted with surprising ease, revealing a small storage compartment beneath the floor. She grabbed the lantern from the ground, using its cracked glass to catch enough reflection to see inside. A metal box. It was old, rusted around the edges, but intact. The kind of box used decades earlier by rangers to store documents, flares, or emergency items. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it free. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the table and forced the latch open with both hands. It snapped upward with a burst of dust. Inside lay 3 objects: an old signal flare, a folded cloth map, and a heavy-duty metal flashlight with a cracked lens. The flare could give her away or save her life. Below, someone shouted. Her heart pounded. "Move! She's at the top." "Don't let her signal anyone." She stared at the flare. If she lit it here, they would see her instantly. But someone else might see her too. Someone far enough to matter. The tower had once been used to survey vast stretches of the valley. If any ranger still used a distant cabin or checkpoint, a flare might be visible. She clutched the flare tightly. Her hands shook. She reached for the striker. The moment she scraped it, a sharp crack echoed through the tower. One of the men had reached the platform outside. His footsteps approached slowly, cautiously, the boards creaking beneath his weight. She ducked near the window, clutching the flare as though it were a lifeline. Her pulse raced. The man's shadow grew in the doorway. He stepped inside, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the room. Rainwater dripped from his jacket. His boots left dark imprints on the floor. He didn't see her at first. She had crouched low behind the broken table, hidden by the angle of the window. She held her breath, her fingers tightening around the flare. Another voice called from below. "You see her?" "Not yet," the man grunted, stepping further in. His boot kicked the loose plank she had pulled up. He froze, glancing down. A spark of awareness lit in his expression. He turned sharply toward the table. She didn't think, she acted. She struck the flare with all the force she had left. The red flame burst to life with a violent hiss, flooding the room with crimson light. The man's eyes widened. He lunged toward her. Evelyn surged to her feet, holding the flare out between them. The flare's light cast wild shadows across the walls, turning the room into a flickering chamber of distorted shapes. The man shielded his eyes, cursing, momentarily disoriented. She shoved past him, using her shoulder and momentum to push him back. He stumbled against the doorframe, grabbing it to keep from falling. She gasped for breath, clutching the flare like a torch, and sprinted out onto the platform. Below, the others shouted in alarm. "She lit something! Get her!" The flare painted the entire tower in pulsing red, smoke swirling in the air. Evelyn reached the edge of the platform, looking down at the drop below. It was far too steep to survive, but she didn't need to jump. She needed to be seen. She raised the flare high above her head and waved it in wide arcs, the bright red glow cutting through the darkness. The valley below illuminated faintly with each swing, revealing the road, the ravine, and the distant hills, where moonlight now reflected off something metal? Glass? A cabin window. Her heart leapt as she realized what it was. A ranger's outpost, faint but visible, and the flare would be impossible to miss. A roar of fury rose from the men below. "She's signaling! Get up there now!" Footsteps thundered against the ladder. The tower shook again. Evelyn backed away from the edge just as the first man reached the top. She held the flare defensively, the smoke wrapping around her like a shield. The man stepped onto the platform, half blinded by the red light, his face twisted with rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he snarled. "But I did," she said, her voice trembling yet steady enough to hold. He moved toward her, but before he reached her, a powerful beam of white light cut through the trees below. The forest lit up. The men on the ladder froze, startled. Another beam appeared, then another. Voices echoed across the valley, amplified by radios. "State Forest Service, drop your weapons!" "Hands where we can see them!" The men panicked. One tried to run back down the ladder and nearly slipped. Another cursed and shouted orders. The man on the platform spun toward the forest in shock. Evelyn let the flare drop from her hand. The red glow dimmed as it hit the floor, rolling slightly before coming to rest near the railing. Her whole body trembled now, adrenaline surging through every limb as the men below finally understood what she had done. The lights grew brighter. Engines rumbled. Dozens of footsteps crashed through the undergrowth. The man on the platform looked at her again, but his expression had changed. The fury was gone, replaced now by fear. "It's over," Evelyn whispered. He took a step back, and then the tower platform flooded with white light as rangers surrounded the base, weapons drawn, voices commanding, shouting, demanding surrender. The men below were forced onto their knees, hands raised. A ranger shouted for someone to get to the top and secure the woman. Evelyn sagged against the railing, her strength finally draining from her body. The flare sputtered out at her feet, leaving only the cold glow of moonlight and the harsh beams of searchlights to illuminate the night. A ranger climbed the ladder swiftly and reached the platform, his expression shifting from focused tension to concern when he saw her condition. "Ma'am, stay where you are," he said. "You're safe now." Safe. The word washed over her like warm water. She let out a long, trembling breath and nodded, tears finally breaking free. Not from fear, now relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. The ranger reached her side, steadying her as her injured ankle buckled. She leaned against him, her vision blurring as the exhaustion of the night caught up with her at last. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you home." As they descended the ladder, the forest around them teemed with movement rangers, escorting the men away in handcuffs, others checking the perimeter, others speaking into radios about evidence, stolen items, the abandoned hearse. The storm had fully passed now, leaving behind a fresh coolness in the air. The clouds parted, and moonlight bathed the valley in silver. Evelyn reached the ground, her feet touching solid earth for the first time since the chase began. She looked toward the forest one last time. The trees swayed softly, no longer threatening, no longer hiding danger. They simply stood where they had always stood, ancient and indifferent observers of everything that happened beneath their branches. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Another checked her ankle. Someone handed her warm tea from a thermos. Their voices blended together into a comforting murmur. The chaos faded slowly into structure, into safety, into order. One ranger approached her with a gentle, measured tone. "Your photos," he said. "They're going to be important. You did the right thing." Evelyn nodded, though her thoughts were distant now, drifting through everything she had endured. The rusty hearse, the coffin filled with stolen treasures, the pursuit through the forest, the abandoned cabin, the tower, the flare, and now peace. The ranger continued, "We'll take it from here." She let out a breath that felt like the final release of everything she had held inside. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't even brave in the way people like to describe bravery. She had simply tried to survive. And somehow, in doing so, she had uncovered a crime no one else had seen and saved herself in the process. As the night deepened and the rangers prepared to escort her out of the forest, she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and looked up at the tower one final time. Its silhouette stood tall against the moonlit sky, weathered but upright, like a sentinel that had watched over her in her darkest hour. And for the first time since she found the hearse hidden among the trees, she felt whole again. Subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with friends. Your support helps the story continue.